I'm extremely excited to introduce my next guest. Of course, John Hankey is the writer and director of Dark Legacy. John, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Jason.
You know, you and I have had a few conversations over the past couple days on the phone and by email. Dark Legacy, of course, is the film about George Herbert Walker Bush and his alleged involvement in the JFK assassination. I don't think there's a single documentary film that I've seen that's been more of a red pill moment for me personally. So I'm really pleased that we're having this opportunity to speak, John. And we've discovered through our conversations that for as many things that we agree on, there are plenty of things that we don't necessarily agree on. So it's a good opportunity for me to reiterate that I'm not trying to create an echo chamber here on Crowdsource the Truth, and certainly any guest who appears, whether it's John Hankey or someone else, presents their own views as they see them, and they are not necessarily my views. So with that, John, can you give us, perhaps for some of the Crowdsource the Truth viewers who aren't familiar with you, maybe a little bit of background, and then we can talk about some of your newer projects?
Yes, please. Sure. And let me share that you and I both express that you don't learn anything from people who agree with you. You don't, right? It's whereas somebody who disagrees with you is going to point things out to you that you don't agree with, and will point out holes in your logic and so on that you maybe need to consider. So that you and I both, I think, we have a mutual respect and are both looking forward to learning some things from each other by the challenge of throwing some conflicting ideas at each other. But I was in the 6th grade when I decided that history was my thing, and I might have been. That's the year Kennedy got shot.
Wow.
And the two are not related, right? I mean, I decided that history was my thing before Kennedy got shot, and I had worn Kennedy buttons, right, and been accosted, not physically, but in the presence of my parents, so that it wasn't a serious accosting. It was a gentle accosting. What are you doing wearing that button? And anyway, but Kennedy was a big name in our house, and we paid a lot of attention to him. And then but that summer I read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I'm going into the 7th grade, and I'm reading The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich because my family is German, and I wanted to try to understand how my family could be part of a group that was guilty of bringing Hitler to power. And that book is a bunch of garbage, it turns out.
Huh.
And which is a topic that gets dealt with in the latest movie that I wanted to promote, which is Trump for real? But let me draw that story to a close and just say that I've been a very, very, very serious student of history since the 6th grade, and that I had a 3.97, and I could go on for 10 minutes why the professor who gave me an A- so that I got a 9.7 was disreputable. Anyway, I've been a very, very serious student of history, and I taught for LA Unified for 30 years. I taught history and English and wove the two together because I find that you can get more truth out of a literature text usually than you can get out of a history text. And you get a feel, right? You get the flavor, you get the emotion connected to the events. If you read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and he talks about witnessing, he's like 5 years old, and he talks about witnessing his aunt, who he was living with, being beat bloody by the master, who was jealous that she had gone to see her boyfriend, and the master wanted to maintain her for her own. So that I've had a sophisticated and hardworking relationship with history, again, since the 6th grade, and I'm now 67. I was having a good time teaching my students at LA Unified. I taught in the poorest schools in the district, and found those kids to be just remarkably intelligent. I would teach them about the Kennedy assassination. We'd watch 1-hour program by Walter Cronkite and Nova called "Who Shot President Kennedy?" And people aren't. If you don't know Cronkite, you won't recognize that impression, and that's okay. But I'd show them that, and then I had them fill out a questionnaire, and then we would go over the lies that Cronkite had told point by point, and have them take the survey again. And
it's a remarkable bit of video to see, John, because in the context of a modern viewer, this production from 1964 or whatever it is, it seems so primitive and the lies so obvious. But it's interesting to see the evolution of, perhaps you're loath to hear me use the word fake news, but this is sort of where it began, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. No,
There is a certain quaintness to it, right? To the broadcasts from Cronkite compared to today. The sophistication of what we see today.
I don't know about you. Jim Mars wrote on September 12th, he published that he thought that this was clearly an inside job. I thought that it was an inside job, and I went around, one of my colleagues, I come walking into his classroom, and I have the pictures from the Pentagon, the
Yes.
5 slides of the building exploding. Are you familiar?
Absolutely. Very familiar.
Okay, sure. All right. Well, the LA Times, the thing that I have in my hand is the LA Times, and the LA Times says that those were running on a camera that shot 5,000 frames a second.
What? No way.
I don't know why you would say no way, but that's what the LA Times reported, and I have no reason to doubt it, right?
Well, wait, let me give you some reason to doubt it, because
Okay,
we're
go ahead.
talking about surveillance camera footage from a parking lot outside the Pentagon.
Outside the Pentagon.
And 5,000 frames per second for an electronic camera in 2001, I say no way. Maybe inside a lab at Lockheed Skunk Works, but a security surveillance camera in 2001 is going to be running at 30 frames per second if it's lucky.
I would suggest that if you have a surveillance camera at the Pentagon, what is it you're trying to do? Well, one of the things you have to try to do is, if the Pentagon is hit by a projectile, you want to be able to get a picture of the projectile, and you're not going to do that at 30 frames a second. And this isn't the 7-Eleven parking lot, which also has a camera.
Well,
This is the Pentagon parking lot, and it doesn't matter. We're not going to argue about that. The point is, I walked into the guy's classroom, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Hankey," because, I'm well respected. I work hard and pay lots of attention. "Mr. Hankey, come on in." And I said, "Yeah, I wanted to talk to you for a second." He says, No, say it in front of my kids, because, we have an open classroom here, and we're all learning together. And so I presented to them this evidence that a plane did not hit the Pentagon, and he told me to never come back.
wow.
Anyway, but not to say that it was still a wonderful experience. I'm watching, so I'm showing my kids the Zapruder film, Walter Cronkite's version of the Zapruder film, and this kid sees it, and he says, "Look at the driver! Look at the driver! Look at the driver!" And if you look at the driver is whipping his head back and forth.
Yeah.
And it tends to be very, very incriminating of the driver, and we'll get to all that. But we were talking about conspiracy theories and how it's my observation that the vast majority of Trump supporters that I know believe that 9/11 was an inside job. And it's my observation that a very large majority of Trump supporters, including Roseanne, believed that 9/11 was an inside job. And I'm sorry, I'm remembering you saying how unsophisticated the Kennedy assassination seemed, and we're going to get to that.
No. I meant the news broadcasts at the
Okay.
time were technically unsophisticated compared to now. It was a single camera on Cronkite.
Oh, I see.
We didn't have graphics. We didn't have
I see
video
what you're saying.
insets. We didn't have multiple angles and things like that. So the modern viewer is very accustomed to viewing things. We all learn this language of cinema that I think when you look at a television broadcast from 1963, it appears rather primitive. So the sophistication of the dissemination of propaganda has increased tremendously, in my opinion.
I'm sorry, can you say that last sentence again?
The sophistication of the creation and dissemination of propaganda has become more sophisticated, I believe, in the 50-some-odd years since 1963.
Can you write that down? Because I want to make you eat those words. Anyway, you know, that's in the most friendly spirit. But I wanted to say that I think, obviously, thinking that 9/11 was an inside job to the mainstream media, that makes you a conspiracy theorist and a kook. But to you and me, that makes you a person of a level of sophistication that is unattained by far too many Americans. And it just so much irks me that they walk around thinking that they're so smart and sophisticated. And
Right.
they think Oswald killed Kennedy. And they think that 9/11 was an inside job. Anyway, my point was that
Well,
the
wait.
place that I wanted to go with this conversation is that I think, and so the Trump supporters have this level of sophistication where they regard the news as fake news, and that's appropriate on the one hand. And on the other hand, I know too many people who want to take the very easy and comfortable position that everything on the news is fake news, and it's not the case. Walter Cronkite, for example, said that the Secret Service limousine stopped in front of the grassy knoll. And it turns out that there are 10 affidavits in the Warren Commission that the Secret Service limousine stopped in front of the grassy knoll. And I'm telling you, people like, you know, very, very, very sophisticated and honest and hardworking people like Mark Lane and like Jim Garrison, the Dallas district attorney and the subject of the movie JFK, and many, many, many others looked at the Zapruder film and did not see that there had been anything altered. You don't see the limousine stop. One of the 10 witnesses in the Warren Commission is Senator Yarborough from Texas, who was sitting in the same car as Lyndon Johnson. The cars are stopped. Well, you tell me how much, if there's one car length between you and another car in front of you, 30 feet? And in the version of the Zapruder film that I got my hands on in 1970, there's this huge bloody spray that comes out of the back of Kennedy's head, and there's any number of important people who verify that. There's a guy named Dino Brugioni who was the head of CIA photographic labs at Hawkeye, maybe it's called. And he gets interviewed by the guy who was on the Assassination Records Review Board, Horn. Horn interviews him. You can find it on the internet, Dino Brugioni, and it's very, very, very important stuff. But he describes this same huge red spray that comes out of the back of Kennedy's head. Well, you have all these witnesses that say that the limousine stopped and the Secret Service got down and they came forward and they stood between the crowd and the limousine, and then they got back in the car, in the Secret Service limousine, and drove off. Well, that's not in the Zapruder film. And nobody has, Oliver Stone didn't detect that. Oliver Stone has this guy Grodin who is his photographic specialist. So my point was that the level of sophistication of those operations in 1963 is absolutely stunning. But the point that I was working towards, that I'm trying to work towards, is that Trump supporters have a level of sophistication that allows them also, and the people that I know, they don't just question what's in today's headlines, they question everything that they've ever been taught about history. And they observe that, certainly all my life, I was taught that the Russians were the aggressors and wanted to conquer the world, and they've never invaded anybody. But they certainly never invaded Western Europe, which was, when I was a kid, that was what the Cold War was all about, was the threat that the Russians were going to invade Western Europe. Anyway, that the people I know, many of them, are having another look at this Cold War stuff and saying, well, wait a minute, this is Cold War. That's the same, you know, they've reached a level of sophistication post 9/11 that tells them that if it's what you're being told, it's probably a lie. If the mainstream history books and the mainstream media are telling it to you, it's probably a lie. And my only disagreement with that is that that statement has to be more sophisticated. Certainly there is a very, very, very crucial lie in the story. Anyway, I'm not even done talking about my background, but I wanted to say that I honor and respect an enormous amount of the political and historic sophistication of the typical Trump reporter. The movie that I'm wanting to promote, Is Trump for Real, deals with the notion that it starts off, you know, just with my observations, my seduction by the Trump campaign, watching him stand on the stage at the Republican convention and just rip the Bushes and Jeb Bush and his brother George for being war criminals. He said there were no weapons of mass destruction, and they knew it. Well, if the United Nations could prove that, they ought to march into Washington and arrest those guys and put them on trial and sentence them to prison for life. Yeah. Starting a war of aggression on false pretenses is the highest crime in the United Nations Book of High Crimes. But, you know, how about, you know, lock her up? How about lock him up? You know, one of the sadnesses of my life will be when Cheney dies without going to prison. But yeah, anyway.
How did you feel when H.W. died without going to prison? I was very disappointed.
I never had the slightest hope that H.W. will go to prison, or would have gone to prison. I mean, you know, look, So let me say that I'm going to talk about my background still a little bit. That sure. I'm teaching my students. I'm very satisfied with the job that I'm doing teaching my students. And then John Kennedy Jr.'s plane went down.
Yeah.
And I was driving to a teacher conference on a Saturday, unpaid, because that's the kind of teacher that I am. And I hear on the radio that his plane is missing and that his wife was on board and that there was a flight instructor on board. And then I go to this conference, and, you know, it's really smart and dedicated and sincere teachers, and I got involved in that, and I put the missing plane out of my head, and I go out to dinner with my wife, and it's, you know, it's in low-end restaurants in Los Angeles and New York City, they have a television playing, and these guys had a television playing, and you couldn't hear the sound, but I saw these boats crisscrossing in the water, and I think I may have been able to make out the words JFK Jr. on the screen. And then Dan Rather came on the screen, and they brought the food, and I couldn't eat it. I was literally sick to my stomach. Dan Rather was the only news guy who was allowed to see the Zapruder film for 25 years is probably not...
12 years.
All right.
1975, I believe. It was Grodin, who you've just mentioned, Robert Grodin, who released the Zapruder film on a Geraldo Rivera program, Good Night America or something like that?
Actually, now that you mention it, in 68, Garrison got access to it.
Right.
And if you were a researcher in 68, I read this somewhere, that it may not be true, that if you were a researcher, you could get access to it in 68. But in any case, Garrison got access to it. Mark Lane, he handed it to Mark Lane and said, here, go make copies. And Lane said, but you swore you wouldn't make copies. And Garrison said, I'm not going to make copies. So Lane runs out and makes a bunch of copies and sends them to people who make copies, who send them to people who make copies. And right. I got a hold of one of those when I was 20 years old.
So when was that? 1970?
72.
72. So 3 years before the general public saw it.
Yes. Um, and that changed my life. I mean, from that point on, that's what I studied, was the Kennedy assassination. So I've been studying this stuff since 1972. It's been my primary preoccupation since 1972. But John Kennedy Jr.'s plane goes down, and Dan Rather. We were talking about Dan Rather. Dan Rather sees the Zapruder film, runs to the television station, gets on and says that the film shows the president's head jerked forward.
Right.
And this is the guy who's on the screen doing the sole coverage of the plane crash of John Kennedy Jr. So I also have a movie called Dark Legacy 2, which is also available on Prime. And if you don't have Prime, it's available for a price. And you can find it all over the web for free. And people send me texts or messages saying, "Oh, your so and so has stolen your video." And my position is, one, it's history. You can't copyright history. And two, good, because when I put them up, YouTube takes them down. Anyway, so I made JFK 2, and then recently I made this thing about, is Trump for real? And as I was saying a few minutes ago, I was very much seduced.
By Trump?
Oh, man. By Donald Trump. He was on Fox and Friends, and he was promoting this story that Ted Cruz's father was an associate of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's extraordinarily likely that Ted Cruz's father was an associate of Lee Harvey Oswald. But hit the damn brakes. Lee Harvey Oswald did not assassinate John Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald was not associated. He didn't have anything to do with the murder of Kennedy, other than that he had been sent by the FBI. It's very, very clear. Good gravy. His official FBI file has like 150 documents in it that predate the assassination.
Oswald's.
Right? They generated 150 documents before the assassination. It's very, very clear that he was recruited to spy on the CIA's gun-running operations in southern Florida, including Pontchartrain. Right?
It's such a detailed story. John, I don't know if you can see the screen share right now, but I was also quite intrigued by Donald Trump's statements regarding Rafael Cruz. And I know that you are friendly with James Fetzer and have probably seen some of the research presented by Ralph Sinkay. Are you familiar with Ralph?
Oh, yeah.
He did a very detailed photogrammetric study of Rafael Cruz from grade school in Cuba up until, I think, October of 2016. And in addition to the photos presented in the Inquirer that were referenced by Donald Trump, Ralph points out that in this very famous picture of JFK in the motorcade with Jackie and John Connolly and the drivers, etc., just seconds before his assassination, right here, not 3 rows into the crowd, we've got both Rafael Cruz and, the name of this guy, Alpha 66, is escaping me right now, but what's the guy's name? I can't believe I don't remember it. But he's pointed out that Rafael Cruz seems to be remarkably close to the assassination in a number of ways, not just handing out flyers with Lee Harvey Oswald outside the International Trade Mart in August of 1963 in New Orleans, but here, right beside the motorcade, only seconds before Kennedy was to be shot. So, although Trump may have been sensationalizing the photos and the relationship, I think there is something there. It's quite curious.
Well, this is a whole other question, but I don't want to dwell on it. The point for me was that Trump, when he was talking about Oswald, he says, and this photograph of Oswald passing out leaflets in New Orleans. Trump says, and this was just days before, and he's supposed to say before he shot the president, and instead he says before he was shot.
Right.
And so I was just completely seduced by this. And I, have a number of very, very sophisticated, Fetzer being one of them, right? Of all of the things you can say about Fetzer, you cannot say he's unsophisticated. Fetzer was the first guy to say that the Zapruder film was altered, and he was pointing to lampposts that are pointing in the wrong direction. And it's all completely correct and just brilliant work. But I ignored it because he couldn't say why. The Zapruder film was altered. You mean you're telling me that they altered it in order to show the shot from the front? What sense does that make? And so I just ignored his work until somebody else, and a colleague of his closest colleague, uncovered these tape recordings of the 4 motorcycle cops being interviewed, who all talk about the limousine coming to a halt. Well, there's no chain of evidence for those tapes. The people on the tapes allege that they are the motorcycle cops, and I'm very, very, very certain that they are. However, you then have these 10 affidavits inside the Warren Commission documents, including one from the senator from Texas, and describing a very decided limousine stop. There are 2 reporters. They had a big reunion, I don't know how many years after the assassination, in Dallas, of the reporters who were on duty that day. And 2 of them were, it was their turn to talk at a table discussion. So they're sitting at a table in front of an audience. And both of them described their experience in Dealey Plaza watching as the limousine stopped. And they were a considerable, they were 50 yards away, maybe 75 yards away. So they didn't have a good observation of what was transpiring on the knoll and between the car and the knoll, but they did certainly see the limousine stop. Walter Cronkite reported it in his reporting the day of. But, you have stuff like Dan Rather saying that he looks to him like the buildings were brought down by explosives. Right. On 9/11. So the news coverage, to my mind, are very similar between the two. Anyway, so let me make this. Well, actually, I was talking about Trump seducing people, and so I have a circle of very, very sophisticated friends, and I wrote to one of them, or probably several of them, about my being seduced by Trump. And this one guy wrote back, and he sent the video of Trump in the World Wrestling Federation. Uh-huh. And I saw that, and he said, this guy's a clown. He is not serious. He is working to a script. And it's kind of interesting. That guy and I have now changed places. But when, so to me, the ball was kind of up in the air. I was very much impacted by watching that video of Trump pretending to beat up this millionaire co-owner.
Vince McMahon. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, when I can remember being in the 4th grade and the revulsion that I felt at learning that one of my good friends, Nicky Chavarria, thought that wrestling was real. Right. Anyway, Trump then chose Pence as his choice for vice presidential candidate. And in the video, Is Trump for Real, that again I would urge you to watch, it dissects this LA Times article that describes in just amazing detail Pence's involvement in the anthrax case. And, you might not, but it's my standard operating procedure that I find articles in the mainstream media that have the headline as a lie, but they tell you these details that allow you to piece together the facts, that allow you to see, well, look, this right here, this is a screaming red flag. John Kennedy Jr. John Kennedy Jr. had one of the more sophisticated private planes around. I talked to the head of the FAA, I talked to the guy who signed the report of the NTSB, who told me that his plane had a transponder in it that would have alerted the tower when his plane went down below 100 feet anywhere. But on the tarmac of the destination airport, he had programmed into the NTSB computer system. And they didn't start the search of the crash area for 15 and a half hours. Well, there's your screaming red flag. Pence, in my video, you get to see him at a news conference, and he's there with the Pentagon doctors who are examining the scientific aspect of the anthrax attacks. We're talking about Daschle and the other leader of the Democrats in the Senate got anthrax sent to their offices, and one of their secretaries died from it, and several people were sick. And you had that whole to-do where they shut down all of the office buildings. And this scientist is responsible for that study, and he says that everybody who has been infected with this stuff has responded very, very quickly and predictably to the antibiotics that they had given them, indicating that this was not genetically modified anthrax. Well, it turns out that the government went on. That guy and his team eventually did a DNA study and found that anthrax had come from U.S. government stockpiles. And in the video, is Trump for real? I show you the UCLA Medical Center website. That's the place that I found it, where they talk about that finding by the Pentagon researchers. So, not all news is fake news. Here you have Pentagon researchers, and they're telling you the truth, that this anthrax came from U.S. government stockpiles. And then there's a letter that Pence, in the video, and it's made reference to in the LA Times article, but it's in the video, that Pence wrote to Ashcroft, the Attorney General of the United States, virtually threatening him for not saying that Iraq was the source of the anthrax, when the scientists were saying it definitely was not. It was not genetically modified, that was the argument that Pence made in his letter to Ashcroft. He says this was clearly genetically modified and came from a sophisticated lab, so it must therefore have come from Iraq. Well, I don't know how you get from the one to the other, but none of it is true. The point is that if Trump chose that guy to be his vice president, he's tipping his hand and letting you know. And then he brings in John Bolton and all of the rest of these people. Oh, man, drain the swamp. He took the worst crocodiles in the swamp and put them in charge of the economy and everything else. It's just revolting and disgusting. But let me rattle on here for a minute. Steve Bannon is the architect of the Trump campaign, and the New Yorker magazine interviewed a couple in two different articles. They were not trying to make this case. They just thought this was an interesting thing that they mentioned in two otherwise not particularly useful articles, that in this woman that he worked with in Hollywood, producing movies or writing screenplays, I don't even remember exactly, she said that he had mentioned to her that Leni Riefenstahl, Hitler's #1 propagandist, was somebody that he studied and tried to emulate, that he considered, what do you call that?
Inspiration?
Well, just a role model. I guess you can't say it better than role model, that he took her as a model of the way you were supposed to do business, the way that you were supposed to conduct yourself. And
she was the Nazi filmmaker? Is that who you're talking about? He
was the Nazi filmmaker. And then in the other New Yorker article, they quote one of his best friends on Wall Street when he was at Goldman Sachs, saying that he, the friend, watched this Bannon-made Trump video introducing Donald Trump as the savior who's going to, make America great again. And the friend says that they started with Trump's plane coming down out of the sky. And he says, the friend says, he turned to Bannon and says, "You got that from Triumph of the Will. That's how Triumph of the Will starts." And Bannon turned to him and said, "You're the only one who noticed that." Well, I'm telling you, you need to watch. And this is why, in order to get this really crazy important history lesson. When Hitler, how am I going to frame this? In 1942, there was an article that appeared in the history section of the New York Times called "I Was Hitler's Boss." And if you get a 500-page biography of Hitler, it will cite that article. Every one, if you come home with 20 500-plus page biographies of Hitler, meaning that they are detailed, that they don't miss 2 weeks in his life if they can avoid it. The only source for Hitler's life and activities from the period immediately after World War I until he became a leader of the Nazi Party is this guy, Captain Mayer, who says that at the end of World War I, Hitler was a communist, that he was arrested by German Army intelligence, by Captain Mayer's organization in German Army intelligence. Mayer insinuates that they tortured him, and you have to conclude on your own that he ratted out his friends who were then all executed, and he then begged Mayer for a job, and Mayer gave him a job, and they trained him to give speeches, and they trained him to be anti-Semitic because, says Mayer, and many other very, very solid, very, very mainstream sources, Hitler had never shown the slightest, quite the opposite. Hitler had good friends who were Jewish before he got recruited by German Army intelligence and trained to be anti-Jewish. And, Mayer says they handed him the speeches, and not Goering. Was it Goebbels? I don't even name the other one. I'm missing one.
The propagandist?
Yeah. What's his name?
Goebbels, wasn't it?
Goebbels. That Goebbels knew hypnotism, and he would take Hitler in the back room and hypnotize him and get him, all worked up and into a trance, and then they would send him out onto the stage. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. The point is that Captain Mayer, the guy writing the article, says that he didn't send Hitler to organize the Nazi Party because it was illegal for soldiers to join political parties, but that Ludendorff, the highest ranking military guy in the country, walked into his office and gave him the oral command to send Hitler to organize the Nazi Party, and that, he said, Ludendorff was meeting on a weekly basis with the biggest bankers in Germany. Well, which is all very, very interesting. And, get yourself a history lesson. Hitler was a puppet. Hitler did not hate Russians. He did not hate communists. He did not hate Jews until they handed him the speech and told him to give that speech and say that he was. And so it's my observation that Trump is a puppet. And I sent you, and I don't know if you have the ability to post it, but there's this another New Yorker article. Now, the New Yorker is a purveyor of untruth, certainly in all the important areas like 9/11 and the Kennedy assassination. I don't know of anything that they've ever put in in that magazine that wasn't just wholly untrue on the one hand, and on the other hand, their propaganda, the ruling elite, the graduates of Harvard and Stanford and Yale don't watch Fox News. Mm. So if you want to propagandize those people, you can't use Fox News to do it. They use the New Yorker to do it, but they drop some important truths every once in a while. They'll have just an amazingly factual article, and they just figure that if they say the main lie, the commonly accepted lie in the title and maybe one or two times throughout the article, that the fact that all of the facts in the article contradict the case that they were making, they will provide you with articles that have just an amazing collection of really, really solid evidence. And so I guess it was like a month ago now, they published this article, and it was called
Private
the
Mossad for hire?
private Mossad for hire. And it doesn't, and then it goes and it details how all of these psychological warfare companies were filled with Mossad people. They were founded by Mossad people. They were run by Mossad people. Their directors were Mossad people. Their lawyers were Mossad people. Well, you know, I'm not the person who originated the sentence that there's no such thing as an ex-CIA agent, and there's certainly no such thing as an ex-Mossad agent. If you are an ex-Mossad agent and the Mossad calls you up and asks you for a favor, you're doing it. There's certainly no question about that. And these, then the article describes as witnesses who said that these people described the campaign that was waged on Facebook in support of Trump, with all of these, you know, Pizzagate, for example, but very, very, very pro-Trump stories and very, very, very anti-Hillary stories, and that they would use Facebook. I don't know to what extent you or your audience are familiar with this whole story, but Facebook sent people down to the Trump campaign, and they combed the millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of registered voters in the Facebook files, looking for what's this person's hot button. And when they found what that person's hot button was, they crafted a story to push that button. For example, this really intelligent woman I met was telling me how Trump was a hero because the aliens were going to take over and he was forming the Space Force. Well, and it was, anyway. But, well, oh, and also in the video that people should see is Cambridge Analytica. It's the Israeli Mossad psychological warfare specialists who worked with Facebook to target the individuals. Cambridge Analytica came up with the platform. And
that's in your video, Is Trump for Real?
Yes, Steve. The guy's name is Steve Wiley. He's got pink hair, and no one has ever challenged his credibility that he is anything but who he says he is. Coming in, that they developed Build a Wall, they developed Deep State, they developed Drain the Swamp, they developed, and you know, they did this using, you bring in a group of people who you think are representative of the electorate that you're trying to reach, and then you run various campaigns on them and see what their reaction is. And doing that, you know, in a very sophisticated and very targeted way, they're able to develop the program that these Mossad agencies describe putting into effect anyway. So they tell you that story, and if you look at Donald Trump's relationship with Israel and just how craven he is, how absolutely craven he is in terms of appointing people who are just ridiculously pro-Israel into his administration and then implementing ridiculously pro-Israel policies, you might get the impression that Trump was a slave of Israel. And I think that the New Yorker people don't mind if you get that impression, because that's a false impression. And let's get back to the Kennedy assassination. If the Secret Service stopped the limousine in front of the grassy knoll so that the grassy knoll assassins could get that shot off, Kennedy was not killed by the CIA. He was not killed by the military. And I'm sorry, he wasn't killed by the military. He wasn't killed by the mafia. Certainly he wasn't killed by the mafia. The mafia doesn't control the Secret Service. And who controls the Secret Service and controls the Dallas police and controls enough of all of the shooters were CIA, right? They were very, very, but they were super, super high-ranking CIA people. They were not operatives, which is perhaps one of the reasons they fired 14 shots from behind. and missed every time, and they had to park the car in front of the grassy knoll. Now, there's 2 points to that story. One is that if the secrets, I guess there's 3 points, and the first one that I was trying to make is that Kennedy was killed by the billionaire class, by the military-industrial complex is what Eisenhower called it, but you don't have to call it the military-industrial complex. Some people call it the Illuminati, and I don't have a particular issue with using that name. And if we wanted a show, we'd take 20 minutes and talk about what that word means. In 10 seconds, it's from Plato's story of the cave, where the masses of us watch the shadows on the wall, and what we understand from reading the newspapers and the history books and watching television, what we understand as reality has as much connection to reality as the shadows that you would watch on the wall from a puppet show. Anyway, Israel doesn't run Trump. The military-industrial complex runs Donald Trump. And if you analyze his actions from that point of view, I don't think that there's any contradictions that arise. I think that that's a very, very solid argument. Anyway, I'm going to jump to the next point.
Sure.
And let me announce that I'm going to come back to the Zapruder film and the fact that it doesn't show that limo stop in a second. But I want to get this point that I wanted to be sure to hammer at the top of the show, and we're a long way from the top of the show, aren't we? But I was saying how Trump supporters have a more sophisticated view of the world. They understand that 9/11 was an inside job. They understand that most of what they get, certainly the core of most major news stories is fake news. And Kennedy was killed by his own government and not by Lee Harvey Oswald or any lone assassin or even any small group. And if you then apply that to the Cold War, and if you then recognize that everything that you have been taught about fearing socialism and fearing communism has been taught to you by the guys who have everything to lose from those two things. And, let me say that, good gravy, I don't know what grade I was in, probably 4th or 5th. My father at the Sunday breakfast table told his children that Jesus was a communist and cited chapter and verse, Acts of the Apostles, I think it's chapter 6. I can quote you the line, and that's better, but that if you wanted to become a Christian, you wanted to join the church, you had to give everything to the church, and the church would then distribute it to people as they had need. If you Google as they had need, I think you will come up with that chapter and verse. The point is that it is my observation that since the time of Jesus, there has been a conflict, a discrepancy between the ruling elite and the guys who make the world go round, the people who grow the food and build the roads and do everything else that's worth doing. And that Jesus was murdered for saying that you need to take care of poor people and making that a priority. And that it's also my observation, right, as a very, very, very careful student of history, that communists certainly don't know. Communists tend to be ordinary working class people with no educational sophistication, or with very little educational sophistication. And which is why they went to Karl Marx and said, write the Communist Manifesto for us, because they knew that they didn't have any historical sophistication and they wanted somebody who had some to write it. But I don't think Marx did a good job, if you'll pardon my saying so. I think that a communist is somebody who thinks that the number one priority of a society should be serving the community, that the government should be serving the interests of the community, that the community as a whole should be working to serve the interests of the community and not to serve the interests of the richest individuals in that community. Socialism is exactly the same thing, that the government, that the institutions of the society should be serving the interests of the broad members of that society. And even if I could go so far as to throw Jesus into the mix, the least of your brethren are supposed to be receiving the most of your attention. And then you have the alternate philosophy, which some people call capitalism. And I'm sure you could find people who have a different definition of capitalism. You can find people who have a different definition of what I would describe, which is that Ronald Reagan called it trickle down. That the purpose of government is to serve the interests of the super rich and of the elite classes, and then you and I and everybody else are supposed to live on the dregs. We're supposed to live on what trickles down. We get to eat the scraps off the floor. Yay!
I think it's well accepted that didn't really work out, right?
Which?
Trickle-down economics.
Well, it's what we got now. I don't know what you're talking about. Trump supports trickle-down economics. He doesn't say it. He doesn't advocate it. He pretends that he supports something else. But if you look at the way that they're running things, that's very, very, very clearly the case.
Well, John, let me reel you back in a little bit, because we're getting pretty far afield here. I think there's quite a lot of things that you and I agree upon. I'm hopeful that Donald Trump will succeed in draining the swamp, but I share your concerns that people like Wilbur Ross, William Barr, these are all people, John Bolton, they seem to be particularly terrible guys. I'm looking at this article from the New York Times from August 15th, 1992. I don't know if you can see this, but the headline is "Mr. Barr Misjudges Himself." And the subject of the article is that Barr, angrily dismissing the demands of Democrats in Congress, had refused to seek a special prosecutor to investigate the H.W. Bush administration's aid to Iraq before the original Persian Gulf War. And you'll recall that so many American servicemen and women suffered from what's been called Gulf War syndrome, that's very closely linked to the anthrax vaccines that they were given. And it's interesting, I didn't know about Mike Pence and his involvement with the Tom Daschle anthrax situation, but there's a lot of evidence to indicate that the United States had given Saddam Hussein weaponized anthrax, and they did not want that investigated at all. So when I see William Barr tied to H.W. Bush, who I think you and I agree had quite a lot of involvement with the CIA and the CIA's involvement in JFK's assassination, even though, as I think we also agree, the assassination was planned and financed and masterminded by people outside of the CIA who perhaps have influence over it or utilize it as a tool. This is very disconcerting when these people are back in such important positions in our government, like Attorney General, National Security Advisor. Bolton is obviously a warmongering troublemaker who I've had several interviews with people that have firsthand experience with John Bolton. He doesn't seem like a very good guy at all. So what kind of hope do we have for Donald Trump having a successful presidency from the standpoint that the average American wants economic prosperity and upward mobility, and to not have wars in North Korea and Syria and Venezuela and all these hotspots around the world? What's your outlook with regard to those things?
Sorry. Let's assume properly for the moment that I want America to be the bastion of liberty and prosperity and equality and harmony in the world and justice in the world. I want that.
Yeah.
Well, what's the best way to do that? I want American businesses to be the top and most successful businesses in the world. What's the best way to do that? Well, the Germans think that the best way to do that, if you get on a plane and fly into Germany today and get off the plane, you can walk into a German university and get educated for free. That is to say that college should be more than easily accessible for every citizen in the United States. I can't think of a single thing that would be more liable to successfully promote the strength in every way, shape, and form of the United States, militarily for that matter, but economically, in every business sense. And but that's a socialist idea. Public education, that's a socialist idea. Well, okay, it's a socialist idea, but that's not the point. The point is we want to make America great, and one of the best ways to do that would be to encourage everyone who had the slightest inclination to get their butts into a college seat or into some kind of training to develop their skills and make themselves as productive as they could possibly be. So that I would suggest that one of the socialist demands are the same. In addition, if what I'm trying to do is make America great and make America powerful and successful and full of happy and healthy citizens, how is not providing people with medical care so that when their kids are sick, they can get medical care? How is that not a worthy goal of someone who's trying to make America great? And my point is that you sent me the link, and you weren't hiding it. I didn't. Aha! But you were criticizing Ocasio-Cortez, and it's my observation that socialists, man, I have so little use for somebody who calls themselves a Marxist, not because I have anything against Marx, but in my observation, most Marxists are not. They're not Marxists. They call themselves Marxists, but they probably haven't read more Marx than I have. 95% of them, at least, haven't read more Marx than I have. And Marx was a conspiracy theorist, among other things. You find guys like Chomsky saying, "Oh, conspiracy theorists aren't Marxists." Well, what's that got to do with anything any damn way? And it's wrong, right? If it were true, so that shows that Marx isn't perfect, and it's not true. Anyway, my point about Ocasio-Cortez is that she describes socialism in terms that are practical and that make sense and that are supported by the vast majority of the American people. If you take, I believe I read this, and it doesn't really make that much difference, but there's an enormous number of Trump supporters who think that people making more than $10 million should pay more taxes than you and I do, right? That you see what I'm saying? That if you benefit from the society that we as a whole have constructed, if the great American society has created an environment from which Jeff Bezos can create $50 billion in wealth, or is he worth $100 billion? It doesn't. It makes he owes us, right? We built the roads that all his trucks go down. The United States, the HAARP invented the internet, right?
HAARP did, the high altitude atmospheric research program?
No. The guys who do extreme theoretical research, the guys who supposedly control the weather, for example. Oh. But so anyway, then it doesn't matter. Let's roll along, because let's talk about Ocasio-Cortez and the war on CO2. And I could let you go first, or I could go first. Let me observe. I know people who I love dearly who think that global warming is a fraud. And, I don't know what to say about that. I have a degree to teach science. I get to teach AP science to high school kids. I have a very, very strong scientific background. The science for the fact that CO2 has a greenhouse effect is 200 years old. 200 years ago, some scientist discovered, he was studying the Earth's atmosphere, and he was studying the properties of the gases that make up the Earth's atmosphere. And he discovered that carbon dioxide serves as a blanket, that the sunlight comes through it, and that the sunlight can bounce out, but the heat doesn't. So when the light hits the surface of the Earth and warms it, that heat gets blanketed in by carbon dioxide. I'll bet a grave-sized plot on the farm that your listeners don't know that there are 3/10,000ths of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. 3/10,000ths. That's a tiny amount. And if you have a tiny amount that is responsible for the globe not being a ball of ice, it's the reason that the oceans aren't frozen, because they would freeze on the dark side of the planet every time it rotated if there was not this. See, this three out of 10,000. It's blanket. Doesn't seem like the right word, but it has that effect. Warming it. The temperature on Venus, I think, is 600 degrees because that atmosphere is 20% CO2 anyway. So, to me, global warming ought not to be an issue. The fact that carbon dioxide has this effect in the atmosphere is more basic than the fact that matter is made up of atoms, and atoms are made up of protons and neutrons and electrons. This science about global warming is 150 years older than that. Anyway, so Ocasio-Cortez says, oh, we're going to convert. And you probably didn't see it. I don't know whether you did or not. She made a reference to the conversion of U.S. industry in World War II. And it seems to me that I spent 5 minutes researching that and found a quote from the president of General Motors saying, and this is like 9 months after Pearl Harbor, saying that their production has been completely, in 9 months, converted from the manufacture of automobiles. They are now producing 0 automobiles and are cranking out superior tanks and trucks. And I guess they weren't cranking out Jeeps, but they in 9 months they completely converted. So the notion that you can't convert U.S. manufacture is contradicted by the evidence, contradicted by history. And, certainly I think that we have much more capability today to do things quickly than they did in the 1940s.
John, let me step in for a moment to address some of what you're saying, because again, I think that there's...
Oh, come on, let me just wrap it up. I'll be
Sure.
brief. Let me wrap it up briefly, which is that if you converted, if you spent the Pentagon's budget, if you spent half the Pentagon's budget putting solar panels on every structure in the United States so that everybody you no longer had to pay an electric bill, how is that not a benefit to the society? Now, the tanks that were built by General Motors didn't benefit the citizens in any tangible way inside the borders of the United States. All of that conversion, none of it helped to make America great and successful and prosperous and happy. Whereas if every business in the United States got free electricity, how is that not going to be a huge boon to every business in the United States? If every business in the United States had the health care of their citizens paid for, how is that not a huge boon to the people of the United States? 90 more seconds. When I was planning to retire, I was thinking, I'm going to take a bus to the beach, and it's going to be a pain in the butt, but there's nothing better for my knees than running on sand. I come to retire, and I see a Chevy Volt for sale for $14,000, and I can get solar panels for $20,000, and I'm driving on sunshine. For $34,000, I have a car that if you Google it, it's a Chevy Volt. There's no record of any Chevy Volt ever wearing out. Or of any electric car ever wearing out. Electric motors. I used to be a really significantly talented automobile mechanic. I've rebuilt probably 12 motors in my lifetime. Alfa Romeo and giant Chevys and so on. Anyway, gasoline motors run at many hundreds of degrees, probably inside the combustion chamber, 300 or 400 degrees. And an electric motor runs cold. And if you don't know, a piece of metal that is heated to a high degree becomes much more weak and susceptible to wear, and there's all sorts of problems that devolve from these high temperatures. But an electric motor running cold has much less inclination to wear. And like I said, I was unable to find on the internet any reference to one wearing out. Go ahead, sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I was just going to say we've covered a tremendous amount of ground, and as I'm sure you would agree, the details of any discussion are critically important. At the top of our interview here, I had just sort of casually mentioned something about the level of sophistication, and I was speaking specifically about the technical sophistication of a news broadcast in 1963. And it was one of the things that I caught on to very early as I was studying the Kennedy assassination. I was watching these news broadcasts, and I'm not talking about the sophistication of the operation of assassinating Kennedy or modifications that may have been made to photographic evidence. I'm talking only about the way in which the news broadcast is presented, the number of news outlets that existed. We obviously had no social media in 1963. We didn't have a 24-hour news channel in 1963. So there was a difference there, and I think that as a modern viewer, when you observe that, it's a difference worth observing. Let's flash forward to the conversation about Ocasio-Cortez. Of course, I'm concerned with the environment. I'm concerned with how toxic pollution brought about by industrialization is affecting human life on Earth, food and water and air.
The coal plants, right? The ash ponds
Mercury
from the coal
pollution from coal burning is a major factor. It affects the fish we eat. It affects our bodies. I think most people walking around have some degree of mercury toxicity that they're totally unaware of. This is something that's been really not studied at all. And the only thing that I question with regard to climate change is that if we want to have any kind of conversation about it at all, if you try to raise the fact that this focus on carbon dioxide above all other pollutants in the environment seems not completely, it seems incomplete. And again, I mean, you discuss this and people say, well, it's settled science. This is 200-year-old science. Don't talk about it. I find it a little bit hard to believe that there is no discovery whatsoever that could be made over the course of 200 years that might give us a better understanding of the extremely complex phenomenon that go on within our environment and our atmosphere, and how perhaps the existence of sulfur monoxide is causing carbon dioxide or some other compound in the atmosphere to have a greater impact. Because I also see that carbon dioxide is critically important to the existence of plants. So I put this together with the knowledge that the Chicago Climate Exchange was created by Al Gore and Richard Sandor. And there's probably nobody more famous for promoting, climate change propaganda than Al Gore. His film, An Inconvenient Truth, is focused on certain things that he considers truth that I think are worthy of being questioned. Now, when I lived in Los Angeles, I also owned a hybrid electric car. I had a Ford Escape, which I really enjoyed. I think the combination of electric motors with a vehicle that can be easily integrated into the existing infrastructure of gasoline stations and gasoline refineries around the country makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of reducing pollution and using less resources. And perhaps a move towards all electric cars is something that we could do. I agree with your statements.
Can I throw in? I have a Volt. It's got a range of, I'm looking at it, 37 miles to the gallon. Mm-hmm. So that if I drive to the extreme end of Los Angeles and come in, Los Angeles is huge, as you well know, mm-hmm. and come back, I will drive the last 2 or 3 blocks on gasoline, right? The charge will run out, right, and then the gasoline motor kicks in. So I buy a couple of gallons of gas every 6 months. I don't have to go to a gas station and pick up that filthy,
tremendous convenience.
Toxic.
It's really great. It's a tremendous convenience.
Yeah.
It saves time, it saves money, it saves your exposure, as you said, to handling gasoline, which is very probably unhealthy. There's a lot of benefits to it. But I'll tell you this, when I used to drive this car around, my friends who were contrarians, or maybe they were correct, they would ask me, well, gee, what's going to happen to all that lithium ion in the batteries, or what sort of toxic mining process is involved in extracting lithium ion from the earth? And the answer to that question is, I don't know. know. So my criticism of Ocasio-Cortez, you may be correct, could have been perhaps not so delicately put. I think she may be ignorant of some of the scientific knowledge that you would need to put together a truly effective plan that would have an opportunity to capture the support in terms of practicality, financial feasibility, etc. It's worth noting that the guy who created Greenpeace, who obviously is very focused on the environment and research in preserving it, says that Ocasio-Cortez is a pompous little twit. Now, I mean, again, that's not the most even-handed evaluation of her. I'm concerned that
It's
she
not very
perhaps,
helpful.
it may not be
but
helpful.
It doesn't. It's not factual. What I mean to say is,
Well, it's an opinion is what it is.
No, it's name calling. And don't call names. Point to the thing that it is that you think.
I agree. I think she's ignorant of
so
science. I think she's ignorant of industry. And I think she's ignorant of the operation of the government. I think if she came in there with an idea, hang on one second, John, because I let you speak for a while. I think if she came in there with an idea like you're saying, some study of the lifespan of electric motors versus internal combustion, increase some sort of tax incentive for auto manufacturers that are selling these electric cars or buyers that are buying these electric cars. I think these sort of practical implementations make a lot more sense than vague statements about unknown technologies based on 200-year-old scientific studies that the counterpoint to any point is that's settled science. It's impossible for there to be any discovery that would cause us to have a better understanding of climate science. Therefore, you can't even speak about it, or you're a conspiracy theorist, you're a climate denier, you're a crazy person, you're a name caller, you're a Trump supporter. I'm just saying, I don't think Ocasio-Cortez is what she appears to be. I think she's another cult of personality. There have been a lot of questions about her involvement with the political action committee that financed her campaign, her chief of staff who was doing things with money. And I'm not trying to absolve Donald Trump or Wilbur Ross or Hillary Clinton or anybody else who's done these things with money. But here we see Ocasio-Cortez presenting herself as one thing, but yet everywhere she appears, she seems to have these very expensive high fashion clothing that she's wearing, and she says that she is a supporter of socialism who wants to eliminate air travel, but yet she's taking the plane between New York City and Washington, D.C.
She said she wants to eliminate air travel?
Yes, the Green New Deal wants to eliminate all air travel.
Baloney.
It says it.
You find that for me. You've been sitting there Googling stuff. Google that. And let me talk for a minute.
Sure.
Which is to say, you use the word feasibility. And I just told you, for $35,000, I never have to buy gasoline. I've reduced my gasoline consumption by at least 95%. And with zero effort, right? I didn't have to do anything except come up with the $35,000. But if
that's something.
Yeah, needed $35,000 is something.
I don't have $35,000 right now.
Well, yeah, but you can get a loan. The utility companies. My point is that this is not rocket science. It is stone feasible that if you're the government, and it's a reason for talking about the banking system, but if the government could issue loans, I forget one of these, North Dakota, one of those states founded their own bank, and they loan money to their own projects at very, very favorable interest rates. If the United States government of the state of California or the city of Los Angeles or the mandated to the Department of Water and Power, you are going to loan money to people to implement these programs because we need these programs. Well, all I got to do is go down to the bank and say, we want the money. And all the bank has to do is say yes. So these things are really, really, really feasible. You were talking about the sophistication of it. And Roosevelt called in the heads of General Motors and Ford and American Motors and U.S. Steel and so on and said, you're converting to war production tomorrow, meeting over by. Have a nice day. I'll see you. I'll see you in a week, or you come back tomorrow with a plan and talk to my advisors about it. But you have to make the decision that this is what you're going to do. And once you have made the decision, nothing could be more feasible.
Well, I agree with you, John, but I mean, we're talking about a company that's engaged in making cars and trucks, switching over to making tanks. That's a pretty direct conversion. Ocasio-Cortez has proposed these vague, as yet unknown technologies that need to be invented.
You're saying that going from making cars to making tanks is a straightforward conversion compared to
They both have engines, they are
making
mechanical. I'm just saying, she hasn't even named a technology. If Ocasio-Cortez said, hey, this Chevy Volt, if we say, hey, Chevrolet, you're going to get a tax incentive to have X% of your automotive fleet converted to electric cars by 2025, that's a plan that makes sense. I'm just saying we've got this vague statement about unknown technologies.
History shows that if you said, hey, General Motors and Nissan and Toyota and everybody else who wants to sell a car in the United States, in 9 months, you're not going to be producing anything that can't be plugged in and get a range of, today, I mean, 70 miles as a range is standard in the least that you'll get in any sort of a hybrid. And you're going to do that in 9 months. They could do it. They could probably do it in 4 months.
I'd be interested to see a proposal for that.
And instead, Chevy, well, I mean, if they could do it in 1942 in 9 months, in 2019, I'm sure they could do it much, much more rapidly. And they already have the things in production. I don't even know if Chevy they must have been producing a few tanks for the military. They must have had the designs in place. They must have known what the machinery looked like, so they only had to make more of it and convert. But my point is that they're already making electric cars. The Teslas are built with parts that they get out of a catalog. Tesla doesn't manufacture the parts for Tesla, except maybe the frames and the fenders. But all of the electric components, they buy off the shelf from somebody else who manufactures them.
John, if Ms. Ocasio-Cortez had proposed a plan to incentivize industry to produce a huge number of electric cars and a plan where homeowners would be given a tax benefit to put solar panels on their roofs, I think these are smart things that make sense, that use available technologies. And I think that if you got engineers and scientists who know about those technologies together with actuaries and accounting lawyers and tax lawyers, probably a very sensible plan could be devised that would save money, create jobs, reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, and do a lot of intelligent things. But I just don't think that this Green New Deal represents that. I think it represents a plan written by inexperienced people who are ignorant of the facts of science, industry, practicality, and anything other than going on TV and Twitter and riling people up by being the right person at the right time who say she is the answer to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the reality show president, and I feel like somebody sat around and said, we need a reality show countermeasure to Donald Trump. Someone who looks like they would win American Idol or Survivor or something, capture people's attention in a pop culture kind of a way, be an expert at social media, young, attractive, vibrant, with different ideas. And she is that, but I just don't think these ideas are exactly what they want us to think they are. John, listen, I think you and I could speak for hours and hours. We've exceeded our 1 hour here, so I'd love to have you back in the future to discuss this and more. We haven't even really gone in depth into JFK Jr., Rafael Cruz, the details of Ted Shackley and all these other CIA guys who were involved in the JFK assassination and how they carried through to the...
How much more time could you give me?
Well, we could go on for sure. Let me, please have some more time and give us sort of a closing statement here.
Well, it's the main thrust.
Sure.
Right. It's what I have been working on for the last 50 years. And I mentioned and we talked about this previously on the phone, but I mentioned that the Zapruder film shows that the limousine stopped in front of the grassy knoll.
Mm.
That's freaking huge. The driver, I think his name was
You're
Greer.
saying it did not show it stopped, the Zapruder film.
The limousine stopped, and
But the film doesn't show that.
The Zapruder film. The Zapruder film does not show that,
Right.
which indicates that the Zapruder film was a fraud. But skip that for a moment. My point is that the Secret Service was clearly, completely involved in Kennedy's murder, and they had orders: do not let that limousine leave Dealey Plaza if Kennedy is still alive. And I have to give them props. That's a good plan. And the point, this is a sub point to that these guys are experienced operatives. On the one hand, everything was a disaster. That is, and experienced operatives know that everything that can go wrong will go wrong. Kennedy was supposed to get shot from behind. They shot, you can see, right? There's evidence, physical evidence for 14 shots having been shot from behind. And David Lifton says he doesn't think that they ever hit Kennedy. David Lifton thinks that the hole in Kennedy's back was a fraud, that it was put there by the people who stole the body off of Air Force One, and that's why David Lifton documents. He's got all of the witnesses at Bethesda say the body arrived in a pinkish gray shipping casket 20 minutes before Jackie and the bronze casket arrived. Very, very sophisticated operation. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong. The four shooters two of them got photographed, all of them got arrested, and all of them got described in incredible detail. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong. Oswald was supposed to get shot in the theater, and instead he gets paraded in, and he's giving speeches in front of the cameras, the news cameras, that he's a patsy, that he's innocent, that he didn't shoot anyone. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong. So in that situation, given that these guys are experienced and really competent operatives, that is to say, right, all these guys got arrested, and then they got escorted out the back of the police station. Well, if you know that that everything that can go wrong will go wrong, you're prepared for the fact that your shooters are going to get arrested, and you're not surprised, and you have a plan about how you're going to deal with that when it happens. But the question is, and I'd like everybody to put it in park and put their feet up, why didn't they poison him?
JFK,
right? If there was an article in the Atlantic, a lengthy article about all of his very serious health problems. He got several powerful medications a day. He got at least 5 injections. I can never remember whether it's 5 or 8 injections he got a day. But if you're the Secret Service, all you have to do is have one of the agents grab one of the doctors by the elbow and say, "Can I talk to you for a second, Doc?" While the other agent grabs the bag and switches out the vials from which Kennedy gets his injections. The doctor goes in, administers a lethal injection to Kennedy, comes back out, do it again, and you switch the vials back in, and you've committed a completely unsolvable crime, right? It's a perfect crime, and if you use the right things, it will look like Kennedy died of a heart attack or natural causes, or you pin it on the doctor, and the vial that you put in is something that he was supposed to be giving him, but it's in a lethal dosage, and then the doctor's to blame. You involved 2 Secret Service agents in that. To me, it appears to be completely foolproof. Why would you ever choose to shoot him in the street when you know that everything that can go wrong will go wrong? And I've made the statement that I don't think anyone should offer an opinion about the Kennedy assassination until they can answer that question. Now, that's for me, that's one landmark. That's one place you got to plant your flag and not move until you have resolved that issue. The second one, and in my schooling, Mark Lane, the movie JFK throws a lot of blame on Lyndon Johnson and insinuates that Lyndon Johnson was involved in the assassination. And then you have people, I want to say monsters, like Roger Stone and Phil Nelson, really criminal purveyors of lies, running around, all this crap about Mac Wallace, but that's the most minor of it.
Didn't they find his fingerprint on the 6th floor?
No, they didn't. You will find people. What's the guy's name? Robert Morrow is one of the most avid Johnson did it advocates, but I also find that Robert Morrow is the most reliable. He sends stuff to me all the time that he says, oh, this shows Johnson did it. And I look at it and I say, that shows Johnson didn't do it, but it's reliable. It's not some lie that you made up. It's not some piece of garbage. Anyway, Johnson is president, November 23rd. This is documented. There are audio tapes. John McCone, the head of the CIA, calls up Lyndon Johnson and says, we have tapes of Oswald in Mexico. He was working with the Russians when he assassinated John Kennedy. And Lyndon Johnson says, oh my goodness, this is World War III stuff. And John McCone says, yeah, it's terrible. And Johnson hangs up the phone, very deeply disturbed, and the phone rings and it's Hoover. And Hoover says, I have the tape, and that is not Oswald on the tape. Two of my boys who questioned Oswald for 10 hours have flown into Washington and listened to the tape, and that is not Oswald on the tape. The CIA is lying to you. And Johnson and Hoover look at each other. Well, if the CIA created this fake tape, they're involved in the assassination. They had to have done that in advance. This is part of an orchestration, and the people, I'm not suggesting that McCone knew that what he was telling Johnson was a lie, and not suggesting that Johnson thought that McCone was lying to him, but he thought that that the CIA was very deeply infiltrated by people who were lying. Okay. There's no way, I would argue, that Johnson from that point on did not rely on Hoover to tap everybody's phones in order to find out who in his administration was lying to him about everything else that they were saying to him. Now, we're coming to the next one. There's a couple of different witnesses. George Ball and Tom Hughes were both at the meeting where they walked in to Johnson and said, there's been an unprovoked attack on the ships in the Bay of Pigs. And Hughes goes into enormous detail because he walked out of that meeting and he took a bunch of notes, and so he still has them. Johnson came walking in laughing. They had told him that there was an emergency, and he came walking in laughing, saying, all right, what's the big emergency? And then he looks around and he sees that the Bundys, who were in charge of the Gulf of Tonkin fraud, are not there, and he starts laughing. He thinks it's funny that these guys are going to present this thing to him and the perpetrators are not there. And so they say, oh, Mr. President, there was an unprovoked attack on our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. And Johnson says, well, who the hell would want to do a damn fool thing like that? And which is to say, he's immediately pointing out the North Vietnamese did not want the United States in Vietnam. They didn't want to escalate the war. They wanted the United States to leave, and they didn't think that the way to get the United States to leave was by escalating the war. And Johnson understood that very fundamentally, that the North Vietnamese would not have done a thing like that. And anyway, I could go on that point, and I won't. Johnson says, well, what about these secret operations that we were doing in there? Or he says, we weren't up to any mischief out there, were we? And he looks dead at Cyrus Vance, who was connected to the Bundys and to these operations. And Vance says, humming. Well, yeah, you remember you signed off on it. We had these Plan 34A operations going on out there. And Johnson says, well, there weren't any operations going on in the area where we're attacking the North Vietnamese with these secretly, and then we send in the destroyers. There wasn't any of that going on. And they say, well, yeah, there could have been. And Johnson says, this reminds me of when going to the movies in Texas and you put your hand on a girl's ankle and that might be all right, and you put it on her calf and that might be all right, and you put it on her knee and you're thinking about moving it higher and you get slapped. Well, says Johnson, we got slapped. And then he turns on the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and mocks his intelligence and threatens to, he says, I didn't hire the wrong guy, did I, General, making you chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that wasn't a mistake, was it? And he says, I got serious problems. I can't deal with this. This is not serious. We're not going to do anything. And he throws him out of the room. And 20 hours later, he is planning the second Gulf of Tonkin incident. And how the hell is it that he got from completely dismissing the Gulf of Tonkin incident as a fraud, as a provoked incident? And it turns out that the U.S. ship opened up on the North Vietnamese at 10,000 yards. That's in U.S. government documents. The North Vietnamese range was 1,000 yards. So they were 9,000 yards away from being able to attack the U.S. ships. It's a complete fraud. There's no way that the North Vietnamese opened up. This is U.S. government documents I'm talking about. There's not the slightest possibility. And Johnson seemed to understand that. And the next 20 hours later, he's got his head together with McNamara, planning continued 34A operations, continued DeSoto patrols, the patrols of the destroyer. So I'm sitting there pondering these two questions. How did they turn Johnson's mind around? And why did the Secret Service not poison Kennedy? And then I remember Fletcher Prouty saying, Fletcher Prouty is, did we talk about him? Fletcher Prouty is my hero.
He's great.
Fletcher Prouty, huh?
He's great.
He's the real Mr. X for the people in your audience. In the movie JFK, he's the real deal. He's the #2 guy at the Pentagon. And he tells Garrison they killed Kennedy because Kennedy had signed NSAM 263 ordering the withdrawal of all troops. I could go on that issue for 2 hours. They've changed the documents. The documents that exist are currently frauds. They don't contain that language. Anyway, I don't want to... The point is that why did they blow Kennedy's brains out in the street? Why did they make sure that Johnson was 30 feet maximum behind, seeing the giant red spray that came out of Kennedy's head? The guy on the motorcycle next to Johnson had to stop his motorcycle and wash the brains and blood off the motorcycle. The reason they didn't poison Kennedy was they wanted Johnson to get the message. And the reason that Johnson changed his mind 180 degrees in a matter of hours with not a single recorded conversation with anybody who supported escalating the war. There's not one recorded conversation. And the Bundy alleges that Johnson came to him out of the blue and said, well, I've completely changed my mind and we're going to escalate the hell out of this war. We're going to, except Bundy told Cy Hirsch that Johnson came to his office, and Bundy told this LA reporter that Johnson called him. He's got two distinct and impossibly, they can't both be true. He doesn't remember because he's lying. And I think that it's obvious that they threatened Johnson's life. They said, look, you want to pass the Civil Rights Act, you want to pass the Voting Rights Act, you want to pass the War on Poverty, you want people to be able to get food stamps and little kids to get Head Start and all this other stuff, and your brains are your signature on the contract, to borrow a line from the Godfather. And so it's my observation that every president of the United States whose last name wasn't Bush, and including Trump, live with that threat, your signature, your brains on the contract. I'm done.
Yeah, it's compelling, John. Well, listen, as I said, I think there's tons of things that you and I could discuss. I really do appreciate you taking your time on this Sunday to speak with me. The movie, of course, that people can see on Amazon Prime is called Is Trump for Real? People can also see your previous films on Amazon. We're talking, of course, about Dark Legacy and Dark Legacy 2. I'm going to have to watch Is Trump for Real? People who have Amazon Prime can get it for free, and there are other purchase options. You can rent it, you can buy it, all kinds of things. John, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope to have you back in the future and continue the conversation.
Jason, I appreciate it, and good luck to you and everybody you may happen to run into.
Thank you very much, John. Have a great day.
All right.
Bye bye.
You too. Bye bye.